Very good. Here we go. Okay, we're streaming.
Okay, Adab. Welcome to Decolonial Islamic Spiritualities, a webinar series that is co-hosted by Habib University's Department of Comparative Humanities and the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. I'm Nauman Naqvi. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Comparative Humanities here at Habib University. Unfortunately, my usual companion, my colleague at the University of Exeter, the director of the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies, Professor Sajjad Rizvi, is unable to be with us this evening. So unlike our usual pattern, I'll introduce our very distinguished speaker today, who it's really a pleasure, and I'm very grateful to him for taking the time out to talk to us. But first, I'd like to say something about the series. So Decolonial Islamic Spiritualities, in the academic year 2020-2021, as many of you might know, Habib University's program in Comparative Humanities and the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies, we launched a fortnightly web series titled Islam After Colonialism. The series charted the dramatic transformations under the devastating global impact of modern apartheid colonial rule in the nature of Islam in South Asia, where that was a South Asia focused series across culture, religion, politics, society, and the arts. The decolonial question of alternative paths and futures was an important part of the series, given that contemporary concepts and imaginations of history, religion, politics, and ethics remain hostage to the modern colonial heritage. This year, our new series, Decolonial Islamic Spiritualities, will remain in the same constellation of concerns, but we'll focus more on the spiritual, ethical, and religious resources that have been marginalized or obscured through the co-optation of religion by colonialism and then its inheritor, nationalism. So that's kind of the broad framework. And my very distinguished guest today, Professor Babak Rahimi, is an associate professor of communication, culture, and religion at UC San Diego. He has a range of very interesting concerns. His primary research interests are in Shi'i Islam, medieval and early modern history, information communication technologies, social media, the public sphere, civil society, and theories of modernity. So once again, ideal for our program because he works both on the pre-modern as well as the modern period. So that I'm hoping will give us some really exciting insights. I'm not going to read you his very distinguished series of publications and achievements at any great length, but I'll cite just one book. It's called Theater State and the Formation of Early Modern Public Sphere in Iran, Studies on Safavid Muharram Rituals, 1590 to 1641 in the Common Era. And that's published by Brill in 2011. He has many other publications. This evening, or for us in Karachi, at least this evening, but late afternoon or even morning for some of you, Professor Babak Rahimi will be talking about, this is the title of his talk, Writing Muharram, Imperial Cultures and Cultural Representations of Shia Iran from 1687 to 1879. So without any further ado, Professor Rahimi.
Thank you, Professor Naqvi. I also would like to thank Professor Rizvi for the invitation, and it's truly an honor to be able to present my ongoing research and also have a broader discussion on the question of decolonializing Islamic spiritualities. And I think that's a very important key term, Islamic spiritualities. How do we understand it? How do we understand the ideal or the very practice and the concrete reality of the Islamic spirituality in the world that is assumed to be decolonialized, but yet we still see the remains of the colonial in the everyday in so many different ways. And this is what really this presentation is supposed to do on so many levels, I hope. I have tried my best to condense many of the arguments that are brought up in this discussion. But what I do want to do is basically provide a kind of a grand narrative in which hopefully multiple audiences could have different understandings, yet have a kind of a shared discussion on the question of the decolonialized Islamic spirituality. Now, as the title suggests, writing Muharram, Imperial Cultures and the Cultural Representations of Shia Iran, actually changed the date to 1675, I'll explain that later, to 1879, is really supposed to show the connection between discourse, language, but also different forms of representation, including visuality, different systems and techniques of visuality in which other societies, specifically non-Western societies, have been represented. And through that representation, a distinct kind of subjectivity is produced to enhance and sustain imperial cultures. Now, that is really the basic objective of this presentation. Now, before I continue, I would like to show a PowerPoint presentation. So I'm wondering.
Please go ahead. You're a
okay.
co-host.
Okay, let me share screen. Okay. Okay, are you able to see this?
Yes.
Perfect, perfect. Okay,
yeah.
So the first section, and I need to make sure I don't go over my time limit, which is 30 minutes. It's going to be a section where I'm going to actually read off from the paper, and then I'll transition to a kind of a free flow verbal conversation.
Sorry, Babak.
Sure.
Just so that you feel at ease, you can go well over 30 minutes. You can.
Oh, I could. Okay, my understanding was 30 minutes.
You can go 45 minutes.
Oh, okay. I mean, I'll do my best. I mean, if you give me more time, I'll go for 3 hours, but I'll make sure.
Yeah.
I'll make sure that I put a limit and reasonable limit to my talk. So I'd like to begin with this. For a large span of the early modern period, now we are talking roughly early 16th to early 18th centuries, the critique of imperialism has been among the most urgent arenas of critical historical theory. Beyond the immeasurable economic and political changes it brought, the early modern European imperial expansions exerted a powerful effect on how capitalism and state powers operated through a reconfiguration of cultural representation, along with territorial conquest, acquisition of material resources, extraction of indigenous and enslaved labor tied to flows of voluntary or forced migration. Now, in recent studies of imperialism, researchers, and especially in the field of post-colonial studies, have increasingly concentrated on the complex and at times convergent patterns of practices enmeshed in cultures into which images of Europe became constructed in distinction from non-European ones. The customs, cultures, and specifically religions of conquered or encountered others provided discursive spaces into which new ways of thinking about nature and history could be found through various material cultures, ranging from books, paintings, cabinets of curiosities. That was a big phenomenon back in 17th and especially 18th century, which eventually museums emerged. The British Museum actually originally was a cabinet of curiosity object. And most importantly, learned societies where experiments and discussions flourished. So I'm making a connection here between these societies of knowledge, and also the way in which these objects and these commodities, these scientific commodities, are being produced sometimes on a mass, but not on a mass scale yet, but they're very much dispersed and used in various different localities, especially throughout Western Europe. From Atlantic colonies to Oceania, from Goa to Saint Dominique, today's Haiti, new ways of thinking about encountered others traveled, and in the process of circulation, where through especially travel writing, recorded, published, and archived at libraries as knowledge by vying European diplomats, missionaries, settlers, traders, some turned scholar after completing a long distance journey, coming back home to Europe. Now, at the core of these new ways of thinking were emerging practices of authoritative representations. These are representations in which the person who's making the representation claims to have some kind of authority. Mostly a person who has traveled to a place, to a country, to a region, that gave rise to a kind of a proto-ethnographic texts, especially in the genre of travel writing, based on triad relationship of the European observer, the emerging collector scientist, native, and also, of course, the reader, who gave life to the public sphere of reason, here recalling Habermas and his famous discussion on the European public sphere in the 18th century at growing consumer spaces such as cafes, salons, and emerging learned societies. Now, authoritative representation were also practices that ultimately identified knowledge in detached, objective observations, in what Mary Louise Pratt has called the monarch of all eye survey scene, which eventually gave rise to scientific objectivity in the 18th century. One could also talk about how the Cartesian idea of the self, the detached self, the mind detached from the body, though still working in the body, is also very much part of this travel writing in which the new subjectivity is trying to understand the world, but through the so-called detached objectivity. As a source of knowledge, travel writing's tendency to elevate the narratorial subject at the expense of the other is apparent in numerous travel literature, a process that coincided with the so-called age of discovery, and of course, the age of conquest of Americas, and the scientific drive to identify, categorize, catalog, and more importantly, archive knowledge about the conquered people. To borrow a useful term from Bruno Latour, the French anthropologist, sociologist, early modern European travel writing served as a mobile or transportable forms of information that are returned back from the field to the centers of calculation, that's the term that Latour uses, to which drive scientific knowledge and in a broader sense play a central role in the formation of imperial cultures from the 16th, especially to the 19th centuries, and of course onwards all the way to the present time, one could argue. Now, such seemingly objective knowledge in both collection and representation of other societies constituted forms of creating categories that constituted new definitions about culture, history, society, and specifically relevant to our discussion today, religion. As David Chester, Rosalind Morris, Leonard, and Tomako Masozova have argued, and many others have shown, knowledge about religion is produced, circulated, and institutionalized in the emergence of the science of religion in the 18th and 19th centuries, with roots, of course, in the early modern periods in what could be called New Humanism. In these counter histories, religion, along with ritual as a category, are not necessarily natural categories, but concept formations that continue to haunt our understanding of the world and human action through imperial cultures implicit in discourses of objective knowledge. Therefore, we are here linking how science, the growth of science, especially in the 19th century when it became institutionalized, were very much tied to the way in which these categories and concepts were being formed by these various so-called scholars and scientists, especially from the 18th century onwards. Now, writing Muharram, Imperial Cultures and Cultural Representations of Shi'i Islam, Shi'i Iran, should be seen as an extension of these counter histories through which, with a focus on Shi'i Iran, the particular Muharram devotional culture, which is essentially communal ritual events, are performed to commemorate the grandson of the Prophet, Imam Hussein, who died a martyr's death in the battlefield of Karbala in 680, is being represented in a distinct way. Now, before I continue with the presentation, I'd like to provide some definitions. I want to be clear that by imperial cultures, I specifically refer to networks of people, objects, technologies, and knowledge that sustain empires through flexible practices of governmentality, Cultural imperialism operates in various repertoire of performances. The most important, the performance of self-fashioning through which knowledge and power is produced and reproduced in situated and complex historical and social ways. Now, the case of Robert Shelley is a really interesting one. The ambivalence of an English subject who travels to Safavid Persia, gains knowledge of Persia, comes back to Elizabethan England, and there he's not only representing himself, quote unquote, going native as a Persian subject, but at the same time, that representation denies the fact that he still remains an English subject and a subject of the English monarchy. The case of Robert Shelley is fascinating, and unfortunately I don't have time right now to go in depth with it, but I see Shelley as a great example of a kind of a proto-Orientalist figure who is actually living the life of the Orient he has imagined and lived through the travel experience. And most importantly, he is one way or another state actor. Don't take the idea of state too seriously here, because the state still in the 17th century still is in the making. But nevertheless, we're looking at a great example in which an English character has gone Persian and in return has self-fashioned himself into an authorial figure of what Persia is. And the dressing here, the dressing aspect, is very critical to that self-fashioning practice. Now, my aim here is really to draw attention to textual, discursive, and visual. So by textual, I also mean both language and visual practices of cultural representations through which Shi'i Iran have been interpreted by changing network of European travel, scholar, officer, merchants in distinctively essentialist, though at times contested ways since the 17th century. Now, writing Muharram is about textual spaces wherein the exotic becomes quotidian and the strange becomes familiar, primarily because of representational ways of categorizing, indexing, and identifying specific aspects of Iranian life. Here specifically, Muharram, the Shia devotional performances in hierarchy of cultures. The idea of hierarchy of cultures is going to be central to my argument, because both in the two cases I'm going to briefly take a look at, hierarchies come to play extremely important role. Now, in the first part, I like to focus on Jean Chardin. This is the French Huguenot who traveled to Safavid Persia. His first travel was in 1664, and the second one came a bit later, I believe in 1673. I put 1675 because that's really the first time he is describing the Muharram rituals in the broad span of his other commentaries, travel commentaries on Iran, Safavid Iran. And that's why I decided to put 1675. Of course, his book gets published later. And then eventually in early 18th century, the book gets translated into numerous European languages. But most importantly, the French book, when it was published, it simultaneously gets published in the English version of it. And really, Jean Chardin became one of the most important travel writers of Safavid Persia. I explained that in the first section of my talk. Now, the second section, I'm going to move to the 19th century. So we're looking at two different centuries, 17th and then moving to the 19th century. I briefly explained what happened in the 18th century in between. But what's important in the 19th century is that the aspect, the idea of writing Muharram, the idea of discoursing about Muharram as this ceremony, this public event that is taking place in this apparently exotic land, the Safavids, who are supposed to resemble the ancient Persians in many ways, is now, the writing is now undergoing a major change by 19th century. The writing, the travel writing, though still there, is now becoming more about collections, now is becoming more about trying to find the origins of a European identity through Persia, specifically TAZIYEH, an aspect, a kind of a dramatic performance of that usually takes place during the Muharram ceremonies, and it was very much popular in the 19th century under the QAJARs. Two figures here emerge, Sir Lewis Pelly, who published his famous collection of TAZIYEH plays, Miracle Play, Hassan and Hussein, in 1879. And also Matthew Arnold, who's actually a person in the background of this text, and I'll explain that later, and the importance of these two Victorian figures in the way in which Muharram was kind of reconstructed into passion plays. I explain all of that in the next few minutes. Now, for audiences who are not aware of the history of Safavids, I won't go in detail, but in 1501, Shah Ismail captures the city of Tabriz and declares 12er Shia Islam to be the religion of the new state. The Safavids were kind of a millenarian militant movement in which they rose to power in Anatolia and central Iran and the Iranian plateau, and eventually took over the Iranian plateau. There were really the most important imperial domain that vied with the Ottomans. And of course, the idea of Shia Islam being the religion of the state became central to the way in which the empire managed to recreate the Iranian plateau into a new cultural and religious landscape. Prior to the Safavids, Shia Islam did exist in the Iranian plateau, especially in the northern Iran, Mazandaran region, and of course, central Iran in the city of Qom, or the town of Qom at that time. We also know there were Shia communities in Hamadan and of course, southern parts of Iran as well, today's Iran. But it was not really a religion that was dominant, especially in terms of state power. That changes with the Safavids. There are several institutions in which the Safavids established. The most important was the institution of the Friday prayers, in which was not necessarily accepted or legitimate from the perspective of Shia Imami religion at that time. The idea was that you have to wait till the Mahdi to come back, the Messiah, the promised Messiah, before a Friday prayer would be done. But the Safavids changed that tradition, and the Friday prayer became an important event. The rituals of pilgrimage, especially in the later times in the 17th century, became important ways in which to kind of advance and spread Shiism across the imperial domains. But also, there were other quote-unquote tactics that were used. Most important was Muharram. Muharram as a commemorative event of remembering the martyrdom of Imam Hussein was something that already was present, especially in Taymuria period in Iran, of course, Central Asia. But by the Safavids, it really becomes institutionalized, especially in major cities. The city of Isfahan, the building of the new city of Isfahan in the late 16th and early 17th centuries really combines urban space with the spread of Muharram and the development of Muharram rituals into major pageantry events, into major military events even. In my book, I discuss this in detail, but what I do want to underline here is that the visuality of Muharram the urban space of Muharram, the way it was quote unquote staged in especially Naqsh Jahan Square, one of the most important squares in the continent of Asia in terms of urban space, it became very much of a visual feast for people who participated and also those outsiders who came to visit and saw Muharram and reported on it. But what's also important is that the Muharram ceremonies never lost its kind of oral performative dimension, the way in which through the sound of mourning, through voice, the devotion for Imam Hussein will be expressed in public domains. But what the Safavids also were very good at was bringing and allowing these foreign travelers, especially coming from Western Europe, who are already involved in a number of different colonial networks, commercial networks across the globe. Remember, by 17th century, we are seeing especially France and England competing. And of course, there's Portugal and Spain still in the background, maintaining much of the imperial order in the so-called New World. Now, these Europeans are part of that larger global network, and now they're, of course, looking at Safavid Persia as a possible strategic domain where they could either benefit commercially or they could actually compete with the Ottomans and militaristically even be able to defeat them. Now, these Europeans are mostly either diplomats or merchants, but some of them are just really interested and curious about travel. Now, when I say they're only curious and interested about travel, we should not forget that first and foremost, these travelers are coming from a commercial and background. They're one way or another, they have some kind of social and financial capital to enable them to come to Iran, Safavid Iran, and of course, travel, settle, do commerce, but more importantly, write travel reports. These travel reports are going to be central to the way in which now the Safavid Persian or Safavid Iranian culture is being depicted, represented to a reading public back in Europe. Remember, the print culture is on the rise in 17th century. Books are very expensive, but nevertheless, it's a growing industry. The book itself, I have argued, is a form of a cabinet of curiosity in which knowledge of other people and other societies and other cultures are being recorded and archived into a kind of exhibit of knowledge, and travel reports are no exception. What's also interesting with the travel reports is that the traveler himself, and usually is a he, is very much participating in that cabinet of curiosity. He's very much center of the cabinet of curiosity of the book. The case of the French traveler Thevenot, who I should have put his picture here, is very interesting. He's also dressed in a Persian attire or Safavid attire, is very interesting. He, in his later published travel reports, he has a depiction of Muharram. Now, around this time in 1665, Muharram is very much now part of the urban landscape, especially the religious life of Safavid Isfahan. And, the French traveler is now depicting it. Now, what's interesting is that the writing depiction, the way in which the text of Thevenot, the way he depicts Muharram, is different than this picture that we are seeing here. This picture actually was published in a later publication in which I believe it came out in Amsterdam, if I remember correctly. Many of these books, by the way, were published in Amsterdam, some in London and some in Paris, but Amsterdam was really at the center because of, somewhat relatively speaking, freedom of the press. Again, I use the word relative here. And what's fascinating about this depiction, it's one of the only 2 or 3 we have of Muharram during that time that are depicted in European travel reports, is that the ceremonies are condensed. These ceremonies that take place usually around 10 days of the month of Muharram, remembering and commemorating the grandson of the Prophet and his followers who died in Karbala, they're all condensed into this one visual space. And much of the pictures are actually new classical imageries. I mean, look at the buildings, as you could see. These are all new classical images. Of course, you see the hints of the Islamic culture in the background. And what's interesting is that this does not resemble Isfahan whatsoever. Anyone has traveled to Isfahan, they would not understand this to be Isfahan. But what you could probably understand if you pay attention are these ceremonies that are taking place. Actually, I pointed out in my book at least 3 or 4 different processions that are going on, or ceremonies. The most important is the front stage. There's actually a theatrical going on here. The front stage, these are the rituals of Begin. These are rituals in which the devotee or the person who's participating in Muharram digs himself, or someone digs him all the way underground, except the head. The head kind of sticks out. And usually the person on the ground stays there for days, fasting and not drinking any water or food, in order to show his devotion to Imam Hussein. And of course, some of the travelers make fun of it. They say, at night someone comes and gives them water. What's interesting, though, with this picture is the way in which that is being very much exoticized to a point in which the violence or the self-violence is the first thing you see. And then, of course, in the background, you see all these different kind of processions, which really don't make sense. But it's obvious that you want to show this to a reader who wants to understand all of this in one categorical look, the look of a ritual event in a visual depiction in which could kind of please the eye of that curious reader back in Europe. Take a look. Motion is frozen. take a look. We have no access to the mind and to the thoughts of the Safavid subjects here. The agency in many ways is denied. The agency of these Muharram participants is denied through the visual practice here. Now, in the case of Jean Chardin, a year later, when he actually visits, Isfahan, and he comes to encounter Muharram, I believe for the second time, we get a different kind of depiction. The depiction is not a visual one; it's a text. It's a discursive one, very typical of European travel reports at that time. And the narrative is fascinating. Chardin is not interested in sensational imagery. He is not interested in depicting Muharram in a way that would actually try to, emphasize the violence aspect of it, the self-violence, which, it definitely was a common practice, but it was not the most important practice of Muharram, one could argue, at that time or even to this day. But what Chardin does is fascinating. I'm going to read parts, not the entire description, which I think is interesting. So here it is, Chardin explaining or describing Muharram to his European readers. In November 29, 1675, this he's depicting this, and well, he's encountering Muharram, and he writes this. During this mourning period, in the corners of streets along the crossroads in the square, there were kinds of booths with pulpits and benches around, covered in brocade, hung from top to bottom with shields, firearms, and arms with blade, kettle drums, side drums, trumpet flags, pennants, lion and tiger skins, steel suits of armor for men and for horses. One would have thought oneself in the hall of an armory. Besides, mixed with paper and crystal lanterns were quantities of lamps and chandeliers, which were lit at 1 o'clock at night. The common people of the district assembled and went in procession. At the same time, some Sufi or other somber and devout men start to regale the people with stories of celebrations until the preacher arrives, who takes part in the proceedings with a reading from a chapter of the book Al-Qatl, which contains the life and death of Hussein in 10 chapters for the 10 days of the festivals. He preaches on this subject for 2 hours, rousing the people to lament. I would never have believed the agony which grips the people. It is inconceivable. They beat their chests, they wail and howl, especially the women, tearing themselves and crying in floods of tears. I have been at these ceremonies. This is very important. I have been at these ceremonies and admired the concentration of audience who could have only attended out of intense devotion, although the preacher was extremely moving. This is, and one needs to compare this to the writings of, say, Pietro della Valle, and all these different Europeans, Olerius, and all these different European writers and travel writers who depicted Muharram. But one could say this is the most detailed account of Muharram, first and foremost, the way Chardin goes into detail. But what's also important is that Chardin is providing one of the first instances of ethnography of Muharram, where he's trying to get to the minds of the subjects he's studying, but he stops. He cannot understand them. The reason is because he does not talk to them. He does not interview them. He is not your quote-unquote modern ethnographer. He stops because he's still very much working within paradigm of that kind of an objective gaze in which he's trying to somehow represent himself in the process, representing himself as a kind of a dispassionate observer who's looking at this from a distance, and he's looking at all these performances in which do not make sense, but one needs to make sense of. Now, by 18th and 19th century, that making sense of logic becomes, paramount, with many of these growing or emerging scholars who want to understand Shi'i Islam and now are actually doing quote unquote interviews and talking to the natives. We get that to the 19th century. I'll get that. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But what is also important about the narrative of Muharram by Chardin, of course, is the material the material and, of course, the colonial aspect of the travel narrative. When I use the word colonial, I'm not talking about Chardin becoming a colonial subject of Safavids, but the fact that Chardin himself was participating in a colonial network of exchange of goods, material, and most importantly, human beings. Now, I get very passionate about this part because it bothers me for all these years, who are people who have written about Chardin, who have discussed Chardin in great admiration. The guy who talked about Persia as the most civilized civilization of Asia, which is in itself, by the way, very racist. We'll get to that later. Have completely forgotten the simple fact that he was a slave owner, that he had a young Black boy as his servant. And much of this had to do with the way in which slavery was very much part of the 17th century colonial network of exchange of human beings as slaved objects. Now, this depiction is fascinating. You walk into the University of Oxford Science Museum, which I have, and it's funny, I never saw this painting myself. You could come across this painting. Now, what's interesting is that there are people that have known about this painting, Chardin sitting, pointing to a map, and a Black boy sitting in the back, or standing in the background, holding the map. Very interesting. The picture is not that great. But what's interesting is that, again, none of the Chardin scholars have really studied this particular painting. What's interesting is that a year or 2 years ago, an undergraduate student from University of Oxford come across this, and this is actually a year ago when the George Floyd tragedy was unfolding, and there were protests around the streets, in different streets around the world. The student, I'm not exactly sure if this happened before or during that time, but there is an interesting overlap. The student decides to do some research, and he finds out that Chardin, yes, this Black boy was very much a servant, and she's, as far as I'm concerned, she's doing research. I've been trying to reach her. I still haven't been successful. But what I understood about this particular painting, of course, is just by looking at the painting. Again, the painting is not very good, which is actually, the original is based in the National Portrait Gallery in London. There are three important things that are happening. Of course, first and foremost is in the forefront, Chardin sitting, the great European scholar, former traveler, who was part of the Royal Society and who was also knighted by the king, is sitting on his chair. There's the sense of authority. There's a sense of course, knowledge that he represents or personifies. Then, of course, there's the performance of the long hair, which has to do with aristocracy, with nobility. But then he's pointing to one of the most important aspects of Cabinet of Curiosity, which was very much of a hot commodity in the 17th century, the map. The map itself has a material culture in which participated in the colonial ventures by mapping, by locating geographies for either potential conquests or potential ways in which to do commerce. And that map, he's pointing to Persia, by the way, a place in which he has traveled. He has written a travel book in which the book itself became a huge hit in the European print culture in the 17th and later 18th century. But then there's a boy holding the map. The boy himself is part of that Cabinet of Curiosity. Of course, behind him is a row of books in the library that's supposed to represent knowledge. I think this painting fascinatingly connects the way in which, or emphasizes the way in which power and knowledge very much interrelate. And Chardin and the Black boy in the background are just really good examples of that. I want to highlight that because that knowledge, in which is very much tied to that complex set of power relations, it gets kind of reproduced in European imaginary, social imaginary later in the 18th century. Of course, we famously know that Montesquieu based his Persian letters on Chardin's travel reports. Of course, he did look at other travel reports, but Chardin was the main source. This is the time in the 18th century when, of course, this is the age of the Enlightenment, European Enlightenment. But in the case of Safavid Iran, or at least in the case of Iran, the Safavids have have disintegrated, and we have the rise of Nader Shah, and of course later the Zand dynasty. These are the times that the Iranian landmass is very much kind of in an insecure situation where, you know, many European travelers are not traveling to Iran. But what's interesting is that this is precisely the time, 18th century, when many of these Enlightenment Europeans are now writing about Iran. But in Imagine Iran, in which now Avesta, being translated into French and later in English, is now being seen as a language, a primal language in which originally comes from, which is really the foundation of European identity. William Jones is a great example in which he is able to use the Vedic and the Persian language as really part and parcel of the basis of the Indo-European language, a term he coins as well. And the fascination in the 18th century is really to find, philologically speaking, to find the origins of the European self. Of course, while that's happening, the European self-fashioning happening through the Persian subject, looking at Persia as a place of ruin, at the same time place of exotic, there's something else is going on, the formation of the category of religion in its modern sense. It's interesting that Bernard Picart's famous ceremonies and customs of religions around the people around the world was really first and foremost based on the travel reports, including especially Chardin's travel report, but also it was really a foundation of the study of religion, one of the foundations, theoretical foundations of the study of religion. What's important about this book, of course, is not just certain religions and rituals of these religions were studied in this book. What's interesting is that they were not really extensively studied. What we see here are the set of engravings, a regime of visuals in which religions are juxtaposed, put together, categorized, and made into indexical categories for that European reader who is really buying this very expensive book. So we are talking about a literate community, but a literate community who is very, very influential and is looking at this book in a very significant way. Now, what's interesting about this particular text is the way Muharram reappears. Muharram reappears now in the way in which is juxtaposed with an Ottoman, as the term here is the Carnival of the Turks, with the Ottoman ceremony into one page. So the visual display is fascinating. The bottom part is Muharram, supposed to depict Safavid Isfahan, at least that's my understanding. And then the top part is an Ottoman carnival festival. The combination of putting festival, and by the way, bottom, this is the first time where the Muharram is not described as a ceremony, it's described as a fete, or kind of a festival. Very interesting. What we see here is a kind of a visual overlapping of two events that do not necessarily share a kind of a worldview. You know, they do not share a religious content, most definitely. But nevertheless, they are somehow overlapped or put next to each other as a way of kind of showing what the so-called Muhammadian ceremonies or religions or culture is supposed to be about. This is really one of the only first times we begin to see culture and religion kind of overlapping. And this becomes a very common theme, by the way, especially later on in 20th century, when you get someone like Clifford Geertz basically saying religion is just a cultural system. Much of this goes back to the way in which religion is being visualized in these books that are now increasingly categorizing religion. I should also make a note, Chardin's travel report, for the first time, unlike different travel reports that comes before him, is actually putting religion into one chapter category. That aspect is fascinating, which has really escaped the attention of many scholars. And the reason is, I think, is because now, unlike the previous travelers, which came from a humanist background mostly, Chardin is really epitomizing a kind of an encyclopedic understanding of society in which religion becomes a section of its own. By 18th century, when we're seeing this depiction here, religion and culture are kind of either put together or sometimes they do overlap. And I think that's something very interesting to make a note of. Now, we could go on in depth about the Chardin travel reports and of course his, the impact he had on the European imagination, and of course the imaginary of the social imaginary of your early modern Europeans about themselves and of course about the others. But now I want to move to another century, the 19th century. I'm going to make sure that I finish this in 10 minutes. I've already gone more than I expected. So by 18th century, late 18th century, a new dynasty takes over the Iranian landmass. These are the Qajars, who actually originally were part of the Ghazalbash, one of the tribal confederacies that participated in the Safavid movement in the 16th century to take over Iran. But the Qajars are really interesting dynasty because, of course, Shia Islam continues to be the state religion, but now the Qajars are kind of urbanizing in a very slow pace. They're urbanizing Iran, especially towards the middle of 19th century. They're trying to modernize the army. Of course, they're encountering these European empires. And of course, this is the time that we need to acknowledge the rise of the European imperialism, especially by late 19th century, when we get new imperialism, the conquest of new lands and the conquest of Africa, the entire continent of Africa as well, which is a major development. So the Qajars are dealing with that kind of a European kind of imperial adventurism. And so they are trying to quote unquote modernize and reform on education, on urbanization, a very low pace, very low process. But nevertheless, something is happening, because what we get is that, let me go back to this, by late 18th century, they are also trying to quote unquote modernize Muharram rituals. How is this happening? By late 18th century, we get, actually middle of 18th century, we get the first instances of TAZIYEH performances in the island of Khark. A Danish-German scientist, very important to note, a scientist who was on a science expedition, lands in the island of Khark. It was dominated or controlled by the Dutch, and he encounters what we understand to be the first TAZIYEH performances. What are TAZIYEH performances? These are Muharram ceremonies that orally come to perform and depict the tragedy of Imam Hussein. So there is actually an orator who comes to dialogue with another who's supposed to represent the army of Yazid, who has come to, kill off the followers of Imam Hussein. And the battle scenes are fascinating. To this day, if you go to, especially southern Iraq, you're able to see those battle fights, the kind of mock battles in which they take place. People, the participants, the audience were actually participants as well. They're not your theater audiences where, they wail, they mourn, they cry. By late 18th century, these dialogues become more formalized. They become more poetic, and they become longer. By early 19th century, various different cities in Qajar, under Qajar domain, especially Shiraz, but most importantly, Isfahan and Tehran, are seeing the proliferation of taqiyyeh. Taqiyyeh, of course, are the places where TAZIYEH takes place. Now, taqiyyehs could take place anywhere. Taqiyyeh could take place in the middle of a street, in a corner, in a square, in a village center, the center of a village. It could also take place at the house of someone. And usually that's how apparently taqiyyehs grow. Taqiyyehs grew as a result of them being performed in private domains of wealthy Iranians who wanted to, have these performances as a way of achieving blessing, and of course at the same time doing different kind of ceremonies, and of course at the same time, pumping up their own social status in their urban communities. By middle of 19th century, TAZIYEH becomes literalized. That is to say, becomes a kind of accompanies a bit of a literature, even though it's not a literate performance. It's supposed to be oral performance. But by 19th century, we get the famous Amir Kabir, who's trying to put this into a kind of trying to literarize it. And European travelers are also encountering these ceremonies, and they're fascinated by it. A Polish and a German traveler really provides the first instance of TAZIYEH being collected, the TAZIYEH performances, the oral performances, the so-called noskhe, the text that one of the performers comes to read, even though they're not really reading it, they're just using it as a tactic to make sure that the audience doesn't think that they are associating with one of the holy figures in the ceremonies by performing the rituals, that these nuskhas are now being put together and they're being collected and put into a book and being sold in the European book markets. That's happening sometime around the middle of 19th century. But then something fascinating happens. Nasser-ud-Din Shah, the famous QAJAR king who lived a long life, eventually got assassinated, travels to Europe, travels to France and England, especially visiting one of a number of different theater venues, the Victoria Royal Albert Hall and also the Paris Opera House. He gets inspired. He's like, we should have a kind of an opera house, I guess you could say, for TAZIYEH in Iran. And this happened. Of course, it took a while. We still do not know exactly when it was established. 1867, 1869, there's a whole debate about it. But what we do know is that Takiye Dolat, the Takiye of the government, became the most important case in which TAZIYEH now became somewhat of a full-on, somewhat of a theatrical stage event, where there is the stage in the middle and everyone goes around it and they mourn. And of course, the Shah is also participating. He's sitting somewhere in the back. And this is also the first instance where, one could say that TAZIYEH is becoming quote unquote modernized. Now, I want to be very careful here. They're imitating some of these architectural sites back in Europe, but this is very much of an indigenous process, though, and I believe in Italian, I forget, a European architect was also involved in consultation with this. Now, what I was trying to show here is that the Muharram is undergoing change. It's undergoing change mostly because of the way in which a number of Europeans are not just writing about TAZIYEH and collecting, but there are also many ways in which the Shah of Iran is actually getting inspired and borrowing some ideas. And by that, he's actually changing the form of Muharram, especially in this TAZIYEH manifestation. Now, while this is happening in QAJAR, Iran, which is a very interesting development on its own, another side development is happening in Europe. Many of these Europeans, and when I say many, I'm actually talking about 4 or 5 leading figures who are being read by thousands of people, by the way, in the European reading public. They're now looking at TAZIYEH as a way of discovering themselves. It's like, what are you talking about? This TAZIYEH, what does that have to do with European culture? Well, I explained it. It's a fascinating story. It has to do with, actually, let me go back to this gentleman here, Monsieur Gobinet, who was fascinated by Persia. He traveled as a diplomat to QAJAR, Iran. And while there, he wrote his impressions of TAZIYEH. How did he do that? Well, he wrote it in this famous book called The Religions and Philosophies of Central Asia, where he's actually talking about Iran. He's talking about Babism in the first section. Then the second section, he's talking about TAZIYEH. He actually has seen TAZIYEH. He wants to write about it. But also, we cannot escape the fact that Gobinet, who is a diplomat, a state official, wrote a famous or infamous book called Essays on the Inequalities of Human Races. In this fascinating and disturbing work, we get really the first instances of biological racism, where the twin concept of Aryanism and Semitism is clearly described. And much of this is also profoundly well discoursed during this time by a number of other people. The idea of Aryanism actually goes back somewhat to the 18th century, and unfortunately, I don't want to talk too much about this, but it was supposed to be a linguistic phenomenon, that the Indo-Europeans were really, Indo-European languages were really a phenomenon in which were developed by the Aryan people. The race wasn't really that much used in the 18th century. The race aspect comes in the 19th century, where now Aryanism becomes a full-on racial category. And the idea was to distinguish from Semitism, or more importantly, the Semitic and the Jewish culture. And by doing that, the idea was to show how Christianity either is another formation, is another form of Aryanism in disguise under Judaism, or is actually a Jewish kind of a phenomenon that should be discarded. That's a famous argument by Nietzsche, by the way, who very much, also articulated that view. With Gobineau, though, we are seeing something else, and of course, all these different thinkers have their own distinct arguments. But Gobineau is interested to find the origins of European idea, or at least he thinks that there is an original speck of European identity in the Persian, even though the Persia of today in the QAJAR time is really not the original Persia. But he's fascinated by it. He eagerly wants to travel to Iran. He accepts the diplomatic position. He goes there and he writes this fascinating book. And I say fascinating because this is where we get the first instance where TAZIYEH is being racialized. This is the first time that TAZIYEH is actually being defined first and foremost as a passion play, as even superior to the Greek plays. But more importantly is the expression of Persian patriotism against Arabs. Where did he get this from? Well, he didn't get it by interviewing the QAJAR Iranians who participate in the rituals. I mean, there's no depiction or there's no account of interviews and having discussions. Not to say that that in itself would have been enough, but I'm saying that what Gobineau was trying to do is really projecting his own racist views on the so-called QAJAR Persians, seeing them as first and foremost superior to Arabs, and seeing TAZIYEH as a cultural expression in which very much resembles the Greek culture, but also the Christian European passion plays in which share, just like the Indo-European languages, share a kind of a cultural essentialist identity. You might wonder, what kind of argument is this? You might wonder, is this even a valid argument? Well, it was certainly valid to Matthew Arnold, the famous Victorian essayist. And essayism, by the way, is another major thing in the 19th century, who in Birmingham in 1871 gave a lecture based on Gobineau's writings on TAZIYEH. So, Matthew Arnold, the famous person who wrote and invented the category of culture, some have argued, the person who actually wrote about various different Celtic, and different cultures, including Celtic, is now writing about TAZIYEH. He feels that he has an authority based on Gobineau's visit to Iran to write about TAZIYEH. And he actually recycles in a fascinating way Gobineau's conception of TAZIYEH in a racialized sense. Now, let me read this one short passage. So this is Matthew Arnold talking about Comte Gobineau, and he's praising him. He's saying, oh, look, he has something very interesting to say about TAZIYEH. Let's know what that is. And he says, Comte Gobineau, formerly Minister of France at Tehran and Athens, published a few years ago an interesting book on the present state of religion and philosophy in Central Asia. He's favorably known also by his studies in ethnology. I should also make a note here that this is also a time when folklorism and study of myth is on the rise, especially in Germany, originating in Germany, but Brits, and I'm including here Scots and some Irish writers, and of course, the French and the Scandinavians are fascinated by folklorism and trying to discover this pre-Christian identity in which someone is lurking in the present through Christianity. Now he continues to say, he's favorably, Comte Gobineau, he's favorably known also by studies in ethnology. Okay, his accomplishments in intelligence deserve all respect, and in his book on religion and philosophy in Central Asia, he has the great advantage of writing about things which has followed with his own observation inquiry in the countries where they happened. You know what, this is too long. I'm not gonna read this part, but here's the part I wanted to read. Comte Gobineau suggests that it is to be found in the feeling of patriotism. So he's really reciting Comte Gobineau, and that our Indo-European kinsmen, the Persians, conquered by the Semitic Arabians, find in the suffering of Hussein a portrait of their own martyrdom. So really the martyrdom of Hussein is really the reflection of Persians getting suffering under the evil Arabs, the violent Arabs, the unsophisticated Semitic Arabs. He, his father Ali, the whole body of imams taken together represent the nation, represent Persia, invaded, ill-treated, despoiled, stripped of its inhabitants by the Arabians. The right which is insulted and violated in Hussein is identified with the right of Persia. Where did he get this? Gobineah. The Arabians, the Turks, the Afghans, the inferior races. Persia's impeccable and hereditary enemies recognize Yazid as legitimate caliph. That's not true at all. Persia finds therein an excuse for hating them the more and identifies herself the more with the usurper's victims. It is patriotism, therefore, which has taken the form here of the drama to express itself. He's actually quoting Gobineah, and he's saying that's really the right way to understand Taziyeh as a very distinct ritual, which could tell us something about our European identity. And how we could do that is because something is shared with the passion plays which are still being performed in Europe. What's interesting is that Matthew Arnold is ignoring that passions plays were actually kind of died away from 17th century, 16th century onwards after the Protestant Reformation. They were revived in the late 19th century, mostly out of nostalgia. The kind of similar nostalgia, the longing for myth and pagan cultures and rituals in which people like Arnold are also celebrating in the 19th century. Now, 1879, the most important development in the study of Muharram takes place, the publication of the miracle play Hassan and Hussein by Louis Pelly. Who is Louis Pelly? He is a British colonial officer stationed in Bushehr of Iran. I actually have visited that place where the British used to be stationed. It's now ruined, but back then it was the most important strategic location for the British military, mostly because it's based in Persian Gulf, but more importantly, it actually has connections and it allows communication, it's kind of a communication paradigm for the British after the Indian Mutiny, which took place, and it was the Bushehr military base was extremely important, mostly for telegraphic purposes, mostly for communication purposes, and Pelly is there. Now, I want to really underline this important fact. Just like Chardin, of course, two different characters, we are looking at a state actor, someone who's very much involved in networks of communication, knowledge tied to imperial and colonial and commercial expansions of Europe. This book is being published. Why? Because he spent all those years in Bushehr. Also, he spent some time in India as an officer, and he has collected 33 of the Taziyeh performances, what's called cycle episodes, with different aspects of Muharram are depicted throughout, especially the first 10 days of Muharram. And he has collected them. He has done that. And this is very interesting. An important point to make is that because he had a native collaborator, an Iranian, who helped him actually write down the performance of the oral text, and then put it into a textual form, and then eventually have it published in England. He also got help with two other Orientalists, one of the Orientalists, another person who actually translated. I'm not sure if actually he was the translator, I forget, but nevertheless, this was a collaborative work. That's the point I'm trying to make. And this was another great example of a fascinating kind of a folklorism in which is being put together in a collection as now is being sold in the European book market. What's important about this particular publication is the preface. The preface, Lewis actually is making reference to Matthew Arnold, who of course based his ideas on Gobineah. And he's saying, look, Taziyeh is actually a reflection of the Persian revolt against Arabs. It's really a nationalistic kind of expression in which fundamentally is based on this divide between the Aryan and the Semites. That twin paradigm becomes absolutely central, of course, not with these 19th century thinkers, but in fact, later on in the modern scholarship of Muharram. And this is where I'm going to get in trouble. I don't really care, because this is where we need to do our battle. We need to actually challenge the kind of colonial categories in which continue to haunt in today's scholarship. As you can see, I'm pretty passionate, but you cannot say that I'm playing in a passionate kind of a passion play, because I would argue passion plays of medieval Christianity are very different from Muharram. And unfortunately, repeatedly, we get in encyclopedia entries in today's modern conception of TAZIYEH especially, we get constantly this idea of passion plays as similar to TAZIYEH, and even at times in this particular book by Professor Janet Afari, even a borrowed tradition from Europe. This actually argument was proposed sometime in the middle of 20th century. Later on, Ali Shariati very much popularized it, believe it or not. Ali Shariati popularized the idea that TAZIYEH is a European invention because the Safavids went to Europe, borrowed it in order to come and dominate Iranians in order to create opium for the masses. This whole idea of Safavid Shi'ism. Then this idea kind of get recycled without critical thinking in this particular book in a chapter on Muharram, where Professor Afari is actually comparing, not only comparing, but she's basically saying there are really the same, the passion plays which were used by right-wing politics in Europe and conservative Christians, it very much carried the same logic as Muharram performances. And Foucault, of course, just uncritically understood these rituals and he kind of recycled them. That's why he was seduced. I don't want to get into the Orientalist tropes of being seduced by Islamism. I don't want to get into the Orientalist imaginary in this particular book. I've already criticized this book. And to this day, I continue to be baffled by the way in which this particular chapter on Muharram has been presented. I could talk about this for hours, but what does bother me though, is this uncritical reception of some of these colonial categories in the way in which they not only appear in academia, but also in popular culture. Consider, for instance, TAZIYEH being performed for the second or third time outside of Iran in New York Lincoln Center. I could see the picture to the right. This is another example which symposiums took place in New York University. People talked about, of course, them being similar to passion plays. People talked about how these ceremonies showed an authentic performance of TAZIYEH, of course, ignoring the fact that this was done mostly for a Western audience, and it was done in a way in which it was staged as a theatrical rather than a lived ritual event. But more importantly, this emphasis on passion plays and connections with Christianity, it's something that I argue very much goes back to 19th century idea of understanding TAZIYEH as really having kind of a cultural identity root of a Persian spirit. I could actually go on for another hour. I'm going to stop. What I want to conclude here, I want to propose this finally. How can we represent Muharram? First and foremost, I would argue that we have to do some really self-reflective ethnography. Not the kind of ethnography of sitting and just simply interviewing a bunch of people and writing them down and collecting them. If you're interested to do decolonializing knowledge of Islamic spirituality of this Muharram kind, which is massive, because it's not just about Iran. You have to look at, subcontinent, you have to go look at Trinidad, you have to look at so many places. You have to look at Muharram in diaspora, you have to look at Muharram in London, for instance. Then you have to really understand some of the basic themes that are, I want to use the word foundation, but are very much the frameworks in which Muharram are performed. First and foremost is devotional love for Ahlul Bayt, Imam Hussein specifically. How do you understand devotional love? How do you come to narrate it? How do you come to represent it? I'm only going to ask that question. I have my own answers. I'm not going to give it, but I give you one possible solution. I remember I mentioned self-reflexive ethnography. Consider Kiarostami's fascinating reperformance of TAZIYEH in Paris and in Padua. I think it was Rome too. Sorry, in Rome. It created a lot of controversy. Professor Hamid Dabashi slammed it as a tourist circus attraction. It's funny, he did not criticize Ghaffari's TAZIYEH performance in New York, not that far from Columbia University Press, okay? Not that far. But he was very keen on criticizing Kiarostami's the TAZIYEH. But what he ignored about Kiarostami's TAZIYEH is the self-reflective way in which Kiarostami is trying to point to the fact that TAZIYEH is not theater, that TAZIYEH actually is not a stage performance. And how did he do it? He actually, instead of focusing on the stage, which TAZIYEH actually does not have one, Even in the Taqiyya Dolat, the stage is not supposed to be the stage that we understand in theater, modern theater or Western theater, but he actually focused on the audiences, the so-called audiences. He put 4 or 5, I forget how many, video installation of different people, women, men, who are actually looking at Taziyeh. And by doing that, he shifts the Western audience attention not to the performance itself, which is very important, but to the performance of the audience mourning, because mourning is absolutely central to Muharram. And that was the kind of self-reflective ethnography, which in my opinion is something we could learn from. Kiarostami was not an ethnographer, but he used the idea of self-reflection or self-reflectivity, which is central to his cinematic work, which he also used, in which he used Taziyeh as a model in his cinematic works. He actually said that in order for us to better understand how, one way or another, we need to be constantly in a struggle of deconstructing our categories, our perceptions of the world. Yes, our first and foremost task should be deconstruction. I sound very Derridian, but why not? Why not? And deconstruction is not that far from critical thinking. That's what it really is. Critical thinking of everything that is in existence, including our very concepts that we use. And first and foremost, we need to do a genealogy. We need to go back. We need to take things apart. And by doing that, coming back and reconstructing in a way that could give us a new awareness of not only who we are, not only how we have been shaped, but more importantly, the kind of selves we could be in the futures to come. Thank you very much.
One doesn't usually do this, but I really want to clap. That was really, really just thrilling. There's so much in there to talk about, and so very suggestive and very, very thoughtful. Also very, very pedagogical. So I'm also, as a teacher over here for my students, I'm also very grateful for this, pedagogically rigorous, conceptually rigorous, and for the bibliography as well. I'm thankful. There's so much to think about and learn. I'll be going over this again myself. I'm going to rewatch this session. So
thank you very much, by the way. Just thank you. It was very kind.
So some of the, this is very, very helpful to me, because of course, one of the major ways in which Shias, in where they are in a minority in a place like Pakistan, for instance, but it's not the only place. In lots of places where Shias are a minority, they have to suffer this objectification, especially of the Muharram festivals. This is something that you'll find, especially the more rational, the modern rational side of Islam. A lot of Wahhabi. I don't approve of this use of the word rational, because I think it's actually a bizarre form of rationality that is emerged in modern times, as you are indicating. But what should one say? Rationalistic. So this representation, so a fetishization of reason itself, and which means a distortion of reason itself. This representation of Muharram as this, and it's very interesting, the objectification of the ceremony, the objectification of Taziyeh, of Tatbir in particular, obviously, Tatbir, self-flagellation, that is, for those who might not be familiar with the term. The objectification of it is essential to the revulsion. It's interesting, the revulsion against being revolted by Shiaism, because lots of modern people, including Muslims and even Shias, feel embarrassed. More modern Shias, they feel quite embarrassed by these mourning rituals. And actually, it's not. Tatbir is the limit. Tatbir is the extreme limit, of that revulsion, but mourning in general, because to the modern mind, it's like, okay, 1400 years, this is typical, yeah? 1400 years have passed, what's going on? When are you going to get over it? And the whole premise of modernity, as they say in American English in particular, Americans have a way of putting these things quite simply, yeah? Get over it, yeah? So right, so it's very, very helpful to know that this is in fact a modern and a colonial white supremacist way of looking at Muharram and at the TAZIYEH, at Takbir, at mourning, at the mourning and devotion for Imam Hussein. Yeah. Actually, I'm sure you're familiar with it, but I came across my first exposure to this kind of representation of Muharram was actually, Elias Canetti, his book Crowds and Power. He has a long section on Shi'ism and on Muharram in particular.
You're right. Yeah.
It's in the religions of lament. So first comes Catholicism, and I just happen to have it on my laptop. So he says, religions of lament, so Catholicism and Shi'ism, which he's going to talk about, religions of lament will continue to be indispensable to the psychic economy of men for as long as they remain unable to renounce pack killing. Yeah, and there are these really, really crazy descriptions of Muharram in particular, and of Takbir, Takbir especially, of course, you can imagine, and of the entire crowd. I mean, very much in the kind of tradition of Gobineau, yeah, who, of course, he does mention in this book as well. He says, the frenzy which seizes the mourning crowds during this festival is almost inconceivable. Yeah, this is the kind of thing they, just like you're saying. So, and of course, this is just a 20th century. The guy won a Nobel Prize, yeah, and it goes on and on like this. It's just really remarkable the revulsion that he tries to evoke against these both the religions of lament, and of course Catholicism is also, I mean, in its own ways, been minoritized in the modern period, and modernity is largely Protestant, so the Catholics are also,
as the other. They're seen as the other, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, and pre-modern or non-modern or whatever, yeah. So yes, this is really, really helpful, and of course it's extraordinarily harmful to the to just as you were saying towards the end, in terms of both the self-understanding of Shias, but also Sunni and Shia relations, for instance. I mean, people used to participate. It was not thought of as just this revolting kind of,
that's right,
yeah, bizarre kind of thing that Shias do, yeah. Right. So that's really, really helpful.
Can I make a note of the violence aspect of it? Is fascinating. I mean, you mentioned, of course, that is of course, it depends which locality you're going to see that kind of performance, in which usually in the male specific, but also you find it in female specific rituals in which self-mortification is happening, either through chain or knife or something. It fascinates me that these are ceremonies that happen as part and parcel of broader spectrum of Muharram performances. That's one thing. And the idea of so-called violence of it is supposed to be an expression of devotional love. I mean, that's how the idea is supposed to be. I mean, and as you say correctly, I mean, especially in subcontinent, you have non-Shias who also participate. And we have evidence of that, and in the case of Iran, it gets a bit different, but nevertheless, the logic is the same, that you're expressing devotional love and allegiance. That's another important aspect. But what's important is that, with the so-called modern perspective, in which comes to either condemn it or try to exoticize it or simply focus on that, kind of ignores its own kind of self-violence that is not necessarily so spectacle oriented, but it's very much happening in so many ways. One could argue that the Protestant work ethics is a form of very silent and invisible form of self-violence, in which work consistently is put on the body as a way of having some kind of redemption through work. And that is not understood, especially in the Weberian paradigm, to be any kind of self-violence. It's somehow understood to be self-cultivation. I think this is what we need to do. We need to shift our attention from the way we frame violence as something, especially the way we exoticize it, but as a way of disciplining, self-disciplining, as a way of creating selves. Now, one could come and reconstruct that quote-unquote self-cultivation in, say, the Muharram context of it. We could do that. That's absolutely fine. But once we come to impose a category of violence on Muharram self-mortification as quote-unquote bad, but we do and not come to see the Protestant work ethics as some kind of form of self-violence, that's where we get into trouble. That's when we get the colonial categories coming to dominate our very everyday conceptions of life, which we completely ignore how violence is happening on everyday life without us even realizing it.
Yes. I mean, there is a global epidemic of depression. I mean, I'm sure
Exactly.
a lot of it has to do with this. Everybody feels like they're losers, right? Right? You got to work hard not to be a loser. Yeah.
Just to introduce everyone, the secret world of doing nothing. It's a fascinating critique of that whole the thing we just discussed. So I mean, anyway, it's just
but in this case, so what's interesting is that in this case, this self-punishing is for the reason for that is this narcissism. It's for narcissistic ends. It's for the glory of your own ego in the world. That you punish yourself. Whereas, of course, however, internally, of course, it's as you pointed out, it cannot be merely internal. There are somatic there are somatic effects of it. But here, of course, this self-flagellation, tatbir. By the way, I mean, you might know more. This is a question I might ask you. So what now, of course, tatbir is a hotly debated within Shi'ism. Forget outside. Within Shi'ism, tatbir is pretty hotly debated question. I don't know what I personally don't know. I wonder if you know what the history of that.
Gosh, I think Professor Nakash has written a fascinating article that he traces it to Anatolia, the origins of self-mortification, and he kind of discusses, and I've read this article many years ago, but the idea of self-violence, according to him, is something that could be traced to medieval Anatolia.
Right.
It's
but my question is more specific. My question is, what I'm asking is, has there been such a debate on tatbir within Shi'ism?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it really started sometime, probably even predates, it goes to the 19th century, but I know for sure in 1950 was a very much of a topic debate,
But modern.
I'm sorry?
But modern.
It's
a modern debate.
Oh, modern? Well, I mean, you mean talking about contemporary right now? I mean,
well, I mean modern in the sense of the 19th century being modern, 20th century being modern. Was there a debate on tatbir in the pre-modern period?
That's a very good question. Honestly, I don't know. I know the 20th century, but not 19th century. I don't know. So I'd rather not say something. I wouldn't. I would be interested to know.
Yes, that's something I'd like to find out. But yes. Even if it did exist, I mean, I don't know, but my speculation is that it would not have existed. But even if it did exist, it would have a very different parameters from what we have today, because tatbir today, precisely because of the genealogy that you talk about, is functions in the popular imagination or the representation. First of all, the exoticization and objectification. The other really helpful part of your presentation, this distinction between Arab and Ajam, which is utterly prevalent. It's so important to the constitution of nationalisms, not just in Arab and Ajam, but also in a place like India and South Asia.
That's right.
Where all kinds of questions of self-identity. So in Pakistan, for instance, Pakistan, of course, is a completely modern formation. The very the very idea came into existence in exactly in 1933. But the whole question of where Pakistan is located, because Pakistan seems to locate itself west of Iran instead of right east of Iran. And a lot of that has to do with this idea in which, you know, all of this history, literature, culture was organized around this distinction, this modern distinction, of Arab and Ajam, and which maps onto this modern distinction between Aryans and Semites.
That's right.
This is actually very popular distinction. You know, there's this famous, I don't know if you've heard of him, famous local scholar. His name was Dr. Israr Ahmad. And if you just do a Google search for Dr. Israr Ahmad and Aryans and Semites, on YouTube, you'll find a little lecture by him. You won't be able to understand it because it's in Urdu. But this is what he says. There are two kinds of people in the world. There are Aryans and there are Semites. This is a Pakistani scholar, sitting in Pakistan, And, you know, the Aryans, basically, he says the Aryans think and we act. Semites, the business of Semites, right? How are we Semites? Who knows? But, you know, right, in Pakistan, just by virtue of being Muslim. So the racialization of Islam, the racialization of Islam is also closely tied into the whole thing that you're talking about.
Major. And also racialization of other religions like Buddhism, which was perceived to be Aryan religion. And even to this day, you know, there are in popular culture, many believe that, you know, it's very pervasive.
Yes. Well, that's really wonderful. Do we have any other questions? Aliraj? No questions yet on Facebook. I think people must still be assimilating you know, all the implications of this fantastic talk that they've heard. Unless you'd like to say something else to conclude.
No, I mean, fundamentally, I think I'm so happy I was able to say at least most of the things I wanted to say. I mean, obviously with any kind of scholarly work, there's room for, you know, growth, improvement. There's always, you know, room for further discussion. But ultimately what I wanted to at least do here today was to kind of take few categories and show the genealogy and kind of separate them and let us see that, you know, there are different ways of looking at something like Muharram, but we could also look at other, you know, Islamic spiritualities. We could look at, for instance, Hajj. We could look at, you know, different kinds of pilgrimage. We could look at different forms of being Muslim, you know, around the world, through which these categories come to haunt us. The idea of good Muslim, bad Muslim continues to haunt us in so many ways. And the way Muslim spiritualities have been either condemned or praised based on different, you know, neo-colonial and neo-imperial ventures. The case of Iraq is a good example. I mean, I visited Iraq in 2005. I wanted to have an interview with Ayatollah Sistani, and this is the time when, you know, the Iraqi constitution is being you know, drafted, and of course Sistani is playing an interesting background role in drafting of the constitution. And while I was there, and I was in, you know, traveling throughout mostly southern Iraq, I really came across this idea that the American venture in Iraq was trying to do was the idea was to first and foremost somehow separate up the country, at least, you know, not nominally but institutionally, through different so-called sects. You know, the Kurds as though they're a religious sect of their own, and then the Sunni Arabs, and then the Shias in the south. That's something that really struck me strange, but that's a distinct kind of a category. This idea of a nation building based on sects, which has been especially with the Brits since the 17th and 18th centuries, mostly 18th century onwards. But then there was also this aspect that how religion was perceived by these American officials, especially. Many of them actually did have a knowledge of, say, Sunni and Shia Islam, but fundamentally they came to the picture understanding Shiism based on the conception of the cult of martyrdom. And this was also very famous in 1980s when, you know, the Lebanese Hezbollah was so-called suicide terrorism. And many of these officials were reading these policy papers in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, of course, the Iranian Revolution in the background as well. And they were importing that in the way in which they saw Iraq should be shaped. Now, we could have a long discussion about what happened in Iraq, but I guess the point I'm trying to make is that these categories are important. These categories that many times come from scholarly works. They're very important in the way in which, nations are being built, nations are being conquered, nations are actually being communicated and dealt with, negotiated. I mean, how many times have you come across an American official who would say Iranians are not to be trusted, in the nuclear deal? I mean, these are all racial categories in which are brought into public discourse in the policy level. So I do want to make a connection here that when we are decolonializing Islamic spiritualities, we also need to decolonialize Islamic polities, the way in which Muslims are understood, in particular political ambiances, and through those ambiances, those conceptions are institutionalized in trying to really create and reshape the region or regions around the world. And Afghanistan is another great example now happening in a way, for instance, the Taliban has been described in contradiction to other Islamic groups. And again, we could talk about this for a long time, but the point I'm trying to underline is that categories matter, concepts matter, and these are not innocent things or independent or separate ideas that are being debated among, armchair academics. These are actually ideas that are not only important, but in fact, academics themselves are participating in these category formations. I cannot tell you how many academics were participants to the Iraq conquest of the US invasion of Iraq on so many levels. And that's just one example. I mean, the case of 19th century is really the best example, where imperial conquest was so tied with production of knowledge and scholarly activities. Travel, of course, was very important, but also circulation of ideas as well. So, so that's what I want everyone, I invite everyone to look at those complicated histories, the way in which ideas are connected through travel, not just through conquest, but also through just innocent travel, including tourism. How categories that come to define, say, Muslim spiritualities come to dominate ways in which Muslims are classified one way or another. I think that would be the final point I would make.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you for all of that. That's really, really helpful and very, very important. All of it. I post quite a bit on Facebook, and I was just posting that it's not for nothing that it's not accidental that the idea of Islam as a martial religion. This is just to give another example to the kinds of processes that you're talking about. The idea of Islam as a martial religion flourished here in Pakistan, in South Asia, where the British after 1857 created the idea of the martial races. Yes. So, there's a very, very close, so I mean, you're absolutely right. So it's not just from the West, so there is this, precisely because nationalism itself inherited these categories. That's right. Because nationalism is obviously very much a modernizing thing. I mean, it's a modernizing project. It's a modern project and a modernizing project. Nationalism itself deploys all of these categories that you're talking about. So it's very much part of the our self-understanding now.
That's right. It's self-orientalizing, and in the case of Iran too, a segment of Iranian nationalism, a powerful one, picked up on Aryanism and continued to develop it all the way till even to the present time. There's still Iranian nationalists who argue that Iranians are Aryan race, and this is without even a hint of understanding of the ideological basis of that. And unfortunately, sometimes we even get scholars who use, for instance, Gobineau in a very uncritical way to read, for instance, QAJAR history in a very nationalistic sense, actually using Gobineau. And it's troubling, and this is why it's so good to have spaces like this, so we could have discussions and we could, carry on critical discourse.
Thank you, Professor Babak Rahimi. A real pleasure, very, very edifying for us. Thank you so much. Khuda Hafiz.
Khuda Hafiz. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. And inshallah, we'll see each other sometime in the future, I guess.